way back then. Now may I request Mr. Shyam Divan, our Vice President, to speak few words.
Thank you very much, Amarjeet. Distinguished speakers, colleagues, friends, both on the dais as well as in the hall. It's really a great pleasure for me to be given this opportunity to share a few words and thoughts about Fali Nariman, truly a giant in the legal profession and a champion of core values which all of us have to commit ourselves to: independence of the judiciary, rule of law, and of course human rights, which was something which was very, very dear to him, and he brought it up at several international conferences and on the international stage. But before I begin, just a few sort of recollections on Mr. Nariman. I thought I should say a few words on Bapsi Nariman, because this was really, as was mentioned by so many, quite a team. And Bapsi Nariman, who passed in June 2020, was a stupendous support for Fali right through, but in her own right was a great achiever. And amongst the achievements which remain with us is that she has documented her skills as a gourmet cook in several books. There are books on Parsi cuisine, there are books on Italian cuisine, there are books on, I was just checking this out, and it was how to cook with yogurt, and a huge feast of preparations for those who are interested. And then I was just discussing Bapsi with my mother, and she said that, look, do you know, she was absolutely instrumental in setting up a very, very important medical center, which is run by the Delhi Commonwealth Women's Association, east of Kailash, and which treats up to 80,000 patients every year. And I thought I should just begin, because this is really quite a remarkable set of achievements of Bapsi's. The clinic, of course, continues. It continues to render tremendous service to the community. And to many of us, I think when we think of Mr. Nariman, we also think of Bapsi Nariman. There's one area in which I suspect she differed from Mr. Nariman, Fali Nariman, and that was she was very, very forthright in her speech. She was very direct, and she always spoke her mind. And in the spirit of Bapsi, I remember several years ago, I had written an article in a newspaper which, followed her kind of lead and direction and was, at least in my view, forthright. And a few days later, Fali Nariman met my wife Madhvi in the corridors, and she said, "Tell your husband to stop writing about these things in the newspaper." Because, and when you visit Mr. Nariman's speech writings in particular, you'll find that they are much more subtle, they're much more balanced. They are not necessarily as, they're forthright, but in a manner and in a tone which is far more persuasive than making a very, very strong point. And that, I feel, was part of the secret of his advocacy. So the earliest memories, I was trawling my memory bank, and I was thinking, when was the earliest memories of my interactions with Mr. Fali Nariman? And I remember that I have an old little grainy square photograph, black and white. It dates back to the late 1960s. And I remember this because it was my first camera. It was an Agfa Click 3. And the photograph has Mr. Fali Nariman and his family at the Raceview Hotel in Mahabaleshwar. And it's grainy, but I mean, it's still distinct, and you can see his smiling visage and his sort of encouraging, and the little, it's not quite a twinkle in the eye because there was a camera shake, but there was still a very genial look about him, which is the manner in which we all got to know him. The second memory actually involves both Mr. Nitin Thakkar and Mr. Fali Nariman. And this was at Islam Gymkhana in Bombay, where there was a cricket match between the solicitors and the council on the Bombay High Court, and I was sort of brought there by my father. And the highlight, of course, of the afternoon was not so much the cricket, but it was the tremendous biryani which was served at Islam Gymkhana. But I remember Mr. Nariman, by the way, I should add, the president of the Bombay Bar Association at that time was a very slim and lanky gentleman who kept wickets for the council's team. And Mr. Nariman hurled the ball from covers, and it's the memory of a child which sort of never disappears. And it was a direct hit on the stumps. And I said, wow, that was really something, and they got a run out on that occasion. So this, of course, speaks to what Mr. Dwarkadas also mentioned about his discipline. He was interested in his sports, his walking, his exercise, etc. His time for prayer, which was, I think, a very, very important theme, which recurred, I found, in a number of speeches which he made. When it was never in a sort of a morbid sense, but he always, when paying tribute to people who had passed, etc., would always make a reference that we really don't quite know as to what is going to happen in that next phase after we sort of leave this world and probably go onto a higher plane. There are two themes which I thought I should just dwell on, which have been touched on, but I thought I'll just expand on it. One was as a young lawyer, and I mean the remarkable theatre which accompanied Fali Nariman in court. It also accompanied him in conference, and I'll come to that in a moment. But I have never quite seen anyone in court who has such a commanding presence in terms of just, theatre. We've all been to theatres, and there's that one star actor whom you just can't get your eye off when he's on the stage or when she's on the stage. And I guess to some extent it happens even in the movies, where your attention just gets drawn. It's some sort of a magical quality. And I think Mr. Nariman had that in abundance. And the first time I witnessed it was, I was interning in Kanga and Company. And this speaks to what Mr. Dwarkadas also mentioned, that no matter how distinguished you are, if you get a brief, you have to go and present your case, the case to the best of the ability. So I was suddenly given this task of accompanying Mr. Nariman. Before, at that time, it used to be called CGAT. And he was happy to accept this brief before CGAT. It was obviously a very high stakes matter. And we had an excellent bench of Mr. Jairaman and Trivedi, and they didn't know who Mr. Fali Nariman was. So when Mr. Fali Nariman stood up and, they started questioning him, etc., and at some point that whole sense of enormous theatre, and, the bench was in retreat because how was this going to happen? So they asked him, what is your name? And I remember him saying, Nariman. And then the whole thing, the whole complexion of the bar, of the bench completely changed just by the mention of that name. And that's, I think, another lesson which I have carried with me as a young counsel who's observed Mr. Nariman in action. That he had an extraordinarily, I think Mr. Chagla spoke about it, he had an extraordinarily subtle but persuasive manner on obtaining a certain dominance over the bench, which happened remarkably. And it wasn't with, some sort of a drumbeat of arguments or any of that. It was tactical. It was always very persuasive, always very respectful, and incredibly strategic. And here I'll speak to two things, which I think Mr. Dwarkadas and Mr. Thakkar, who've assisted him in probably many more matters than I have, will also concur, which is the industry of Mr. Fali Nariman. Whether it was a pleading, whether it was a list of dates, whether it was a note of submissions. I mean, this was, it may not have reached a gold standard level, but that wasn't the point. The point was putting in all that effort to try and attain that gold standard. And it was always, continuously questioning yourself, questioning as to whether this can be improved. It can be put a little differently just so that it makes and has that requisite impact. And I think that pursuit of excellence is something which each one of us has to carry forward if there is a legacy that we have to take forward in terms of an inspiration. The point I want to make again, and this is really by way of emphasis because Mr. Bhasin has spoken about this, was Mr. Nariman's extraordinary contribution. Actually, I'll just put two, and I'll sort of quickly package both the points. One was made by Mr. Dwarkadas and one was made by Mr. Bhasin. And the point about Mr. Dwarkadas was that he mentioned the year 40, but probably it was closer to 50. I mean, Mr. Fali Nariman was the lawyer to go to for 50 years. I mean, right from the 1970s, I think from Bombay right till 2020, if there was a problem which you had, at least in the Bombay solicitor lot, and I don't think it was very different in other parts of the country either, what do we do? So the whole answer was, let's go and see what Fali has to say about this whole issue. And I mean, I think that is just a remarkable period of time. I mean, it's like, we always are very we admire Gavaskar and we admire Tendulkar and we admire Roger Federer. But imagine being top of the game for 50 years. I mean, that is just something incredible. So despite these, legendary sportsmen, etc., I think in terms of the lawyering, the sheer lawyering in those areas of corporate law, in those areas of arbitration, Mr. Nariman remained at the absolute helm of our profession for 50 years. And the second point, which was Mr. Bhasin's point, was that he really, I think the expression which I borrow from him is showcase, but apart from showcase, and you heard what Cyrus Das said, speaking for the Malaysian bar, and I think we probably will have a video recording by Mr. Upul Jayasurya as well, speaking from the Sri Lankan bar perspective. But he put Indian lawyers and the quality of the products, all of you, out there in the open stage, on the world stage. And this was really a manner of not just opening up and showcasing as to what we're capable of, but also telling the world that, look, these are very, very high quality lawyers, and not just lawyers in terms of sheer lawyering, in terms of your meticulousness of preparation, etc., but also on the universal values of rule of law, independence, judiciary, and human rights. And I think that has really helped elevate our profession in the eyes of the global community. And of course, with Indian lawyers moving out across jurisdictions, they've also, the world has learned more and more about our courts and about our jurisprudence, which is a proud feature indeed. I want to just quickly segue into Mr. Nariman's, choice of topics, rather choice of titles for his books. And I like really two of them. The one is God Save the Honorable the Supreme Court. And it came out at a time and I said, wow, I mean, what is this book about? And then of course, when you're into a few pages, he reminds you that, look, it's not as if I'm talking about the Indian Supreme Court, or am I? It's really, I'm talking about the call which the usher gives when the US Supreme Court assembles, which is God Save the Supreme Court of the United States and God Save America. But he uses that line very subtly and he puts it right on the cover of his book at a time when, and then his opening chapter in that book is about it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And he really questions. So he's always balancing, but he's also making the point in a sharp manner and in a manner which makes you reflect. And I think the last book which he wrote, which is You Must Know Your Constitution, I think that has an abiding message, or at least that's the message I took away, which is basically he speaks to citizens and says that, look, you've got something really valuable here. Please educate yourself about it. Please learn about it. And please use those rights, those remedies, those values, which must endure if the Republic is to endure in any meaningful manner. And here I was just wondering this morning, And the Hindu had a piece, and I was wondering how would Mr. Nariman reflect on this? What would he say? I know he'd say it very subtly, but the Hindu piece was on our NCERT recommendations to the changing of our textbooks. And one of the references is, for example, one of the recommendations is that insofar as the standard 12 sociology textbook is concerned, references to destitution caused to Adivasis because of the large dams which we built in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s, and which resulted in migrations, that line has been dropped. And that was from the standard 12 textbook on sociology. And the NCERT has also dropped a reference to the Babri Masjid demolition from its political science textbooks. And this gives me, thinking about this whole business. That is, of course, still at a recommendation stage. But I was reading Peter Hessler's essay on Chinese students' experiences in America. And he uses two excellent expressions there. One is he talks about Chinese universities as an oasis of political compliance. And I think that's something which we have to think of. Are we moving towards a society of an oasis of political compliance? And the final expression which he uses is, he talks about educated acquiescence. And I think Mr. Nariman, all said and done, would be certainly of the view that educated acquiescence is not something which members of the legal profession should aspire for. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Divan.